Welcome to Applying Principles-Focused Evaluation in the Sexual Violence Prevention Context. My name is Sally Lasky, and I'm the Evaluation Coordinator with the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. This is a webinar that's part of our Evaluation Toolkit. The NSVRC provides tools to prevent and respond to sexual harassment, abuse, and assault. We translate research and trends into best practices. We support organizations, communities, and individuals, and we also work with the media to promote informed reporting. When we were putting the evaluation toolkit together, one of the areas that came up as a need was more information on principles-focused evaluation and how it could be applied to rape prevention efforts. So I'm very excited that today we have Tatiana Masters here with us to help us explore what this is looking like in the state of Washington, where they're actually doing this work. So now I'm going to turn it over to Tatiana to get us started to learn more about principles-focused evaluation.
Thank you so much, Sally. I'm Tatiana Masters. I'm really happy to be here with you today recording this webinar about principles-focused evaluation, or PFE, as we sometimes call it. I want to introduce myself briefly. I'm based in Seattle, Washington, where I work with a group called Evaluation Specialists. And we evaluate health and prevention programs of all kinds, but we're also right now contracted with the Washington State Department of Health, supporting CDC-funded rape prevention education programming. And so we're working with the community-based grantee organizations throughout the state to help them both build their evaluation capacity and evaluate the programming that they're doing. I should also say that we're re-recording this webinar. The original webinar was created to get me and my colleague and friend Erin Casey, who works with evaluation specialists and at University of Washington, Tacoma. However, she was not able to participate today, so I just want to acknowledge Erin before we get rolling. Okay, a little overview. We'll first introduce you to principles-focused evaluation and talk a little about the principles that we evolved here in Washington State. I'll give you an overview of the process that we took both to identify and flesh out those principles, and also to create evaluation tools and plans that integrate them. And I'll tell you what we've learned so far, some data about our PFE efforts. We'll wrap it all up with a recap at the end. All righty, so here's the beautiful state of Washington. As you know, the CDC funds rape prevention education in all 50 states. And here in Washington, we help evaluate that programming. It's a good time to give this disclaimer. While RPE is funded by a grant from the CDC to our State Department of Health, we at Evaluation Specialists are 100% solely responsible for the presentation today. And these ideas that I'm expressing don't represent the official views of the CDC nor the Department of Health and Human Services. All right, Sally, can I bring you in here for a minute and ask you what you know about principles-focused evaluation?
Absolutely, Tatiana. So I actually first learned about principles-focused evaluation at a workshop that you did at the National Sexual Assault Conference. And then I did a little bit more reading about it. And the big thing that was emerging for me was that it was a way to align your evaluation approach with your core values and principles. And that it's often an approach that's used when you have a complex approach or complex intervention that you're looking to evaluate.
Mm-hmm. That's great. That's such a beautiful contextualization for this next overview. So this is a pretty basic dictionary definition of what principles are. They're statements that guide you on how to think or behave. They're focused towards a result that you desire, and they're based, as Sally alluded to, on values and beliefs, and also on knowledge and really like wisdom, deep wisdom. So in principles-focused evaluation, the kind of rubric or mnemonic that you can think about for what is a principle is you want your principle to be GUIDE, which is guiding, useful, inspiring, developmental, and also, dear to my heart, evaluable. Here's a handout, or here's a slide that is the same as a handout that will be available when you're listening to this recorded webinar. You'll also have access from the same site to printouts or of all the handouts that we mentioned in the talk. And because this is a very text dense slide and you probably won't take it all in right now. So please check out that handout. What this does is it tells you more about each of the GUIDE elements of guide. So when you're trying to figure out if something is a principle and kind of get that identified and written up so that you can share it and base evaluation on it, you can kind of test, like, is this a concept of principle by saying, like, is it guiding? Does it prescribe something to do? Is it directing me in a particular way? Is it worded actively? That's very important. And is it distinct? And you'll see for useful, inspiring, developmental, and evaluable, other fleshing out of what makes a principle a principle. I want to emphasize evaluable a little bit more. You can assess whether something is followed. You can think about, like, what behavior would you see or what changes in beliefs if the principle was being followed. You can document what happens when the principle is followed. And then you can also kind of test and say, is this taking me in the direction I want to go? That's evaluable. I'll mention now that principles-focused evaluation was first articulated by Michael Quinn Patton, and it's described in detail in a book that he published about this, which you see the citation for on the screen. So he goes into a lot of detail there, but my take on this is that, like a lot of powerful ideas, the idea of principles-focused evaluation is really alive and evolving. And so everyone who's going to use this will do it in a little bit of their own style, and that's absolutely fine. Like, it's a thing that is alive and will continue to change. All right. So we've talked about what a principle is. How do we bring that into the evaluation world? What principles-focused evaluation does is it works across practitioners and agencies working in any field, in this case, sexual violence prevention, and it identifies what are some kind of core principles that they work by. It then takes stock, evaluation again, of whether these principles are being implemented, whether practitioners are adhering to them as they do their prevention work. It assesses the results of using the principles and whether it's leading to the desired results. Like, are you seeing the things that you had hoped and anticipated seeing when people are using those principles more? It's a great complement to other forms of evaluation, which I'll talk a little bit more about on the next slide. And it can also support your decision-making during implementation. Like, you often will find yourself at a branching point implementing a program, and then a principle can kind of help you see which direction to go, like the guide aspect of principles. Okay, the way PFE fits into other kinds of evaluation is really a bit of a bridge between implementation and outcome evaluation. So you might be measuring in step one whether you're implementing the intended activities of your program with the intended audience. PFE in the middle will ask you to look at whether you're behaving as a prevention practitioner in ways that are consistent with your values about prevention and what you know about prevention. Are you behaving in a way that supports the outcomes you'd like to see in people who participate in that program? And then finally, of course, outcome evaluation is whether people who participate or communities who participate in your prevention program, are they changing their knowledge, their attitudes, their behaviors in the way that you had hoped? So PFE doesn't substitute for any elements of evaluation. It just gets in the mix with them and helps them relate to each other better. Beautiful Seattle. I'm going to share the Washington State example now. I do want to say that we took a long and winding road in Washington State to reach our principles, but I found that it works better to show people where you ended up. So first, I'm going to tell you where we arrived, the principles that we identified and are basing evaluation on. And then I'll go back in time, so to say, and describe the processes that we used to reach those principles. This is another place that you can get the handout from the website and look at the descriptions and definitions of each of these principles. But what we reached through our long process were these 7 principles, which are prevention is possible, intersectional feminism, consent culture, shared power, holistic engagement, meaningful relationships, and modeling. So do check out the handout for definitions of each of these. Oh, I wanted a slide with a winding road. This road is straighter than our road actually was. But this tells you a little bit about how we figured out that PFE maybe was a good fit for Washington State and decided to go forward with it. So the Washington State RPE really needed methods to evaluate across a bunch of diverse programs because, like some other states, Washington decided that one size fits all communities was not right for the state and for doing RPE here. So they funded 7 different programs. Each of these served a different population. They delivered really quite different programming. But each of the programs had this very deep knowledge of the community that they worked in and the groups of people that they were working with. And they were very passionate about their work. Some of them had some overlap in that they delivered programming in schools. Some were trying to change social norms. Other ones were trying to build skills. So a lot of different stuff was happening, but they were all working towards the same ultimate goal, of course, of preventing sexual violence. Another reason PFE was a good fit for Washington was that we had these committed prevention practitioners, and we also had people on the state level who were interested in innovative approaches to evaluation and in supporting PFE. So we thought it was a great fit and we were drawn towards it for our evaluation because we thought it could really address some of the challenges of evaluating across all these different programs that yet we're working towards the same goal. We thought that it was compatible with some other components we had in our evaluation already. And as people like we at evaluation specialists have a lot of background in academic research on sexual violence prevention and other topics, we kind of dug how it could bring in what research says supports effective prevention in this realm and combine that with practitioner wisdom and have those two powerful forces pulling in the same direction and not opposite from each other, as sometimes sadly occurs. So we liked it for all these reasons. I'm going to ask Sally again about relevance. Like where have you seen PFE possibly being a relevant approach in communities or other places?
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about this. There are 3 things or 3 areas that immediately come up for me. The first is that more and more in the sexual violence prevention field, we are looking to connect the dots with other issues and looking at how we can collaborate with other movements and with other partners, and in doing so, finding those key core values that we can connect around, I think is really critical as we might be looking into new partnerships. I also see this extremely relevant to the work that we're doing to center our anti-oppression efforts within our sexual violence prevention work. And then, of course, what is on my mind the last year is the need for us to adapt. And I think using this approach in really focusing in on the core principles and values can help when programs need to make adaptations like we all did because of COVID-19. And I'm just thinking
Mhm.
for programs that had this in place, it gives you some good guideposts when you're having to make hard decisions about things that you want to make sure continue to happen, and things that may need to be adapted due to a
Yeah.
variety of different circumstances.
Yeah, I hadn't thought about that adaptation during times of COVID aspect, but that really sounds true to me. That sounds right on. Thanks, Allie. Okay, so we've kind of laid out what a principal is, what PFE is, and now I'm going to walk us through the steps that we took in Washington to do our principles focused evaluation, which was a pretty long process that we began. I feel like I should say this well before the pandemic, like I think could have been 3, even 4 years ago that we first started with this. So it doesn't require that long a timeline. That's just how it worked out here due to other factors. But we did begin it when there were still group gatherings. It's important to notice. So let me just foreshadow the steps for you in doing principles focused evaluation. First, you're going to identify principles that are generally shared across different sexual violence prevention organizations and programs. Second, you'll define the practitioner behaviors that would demonstrate these principles are like live and guiding your work. Third, you would identify the ways program participants might respond if the practitioners, the preventionists, were adhering to the principles. And then fourth, you would integrate questions about the principles into your existing evaluation approaches. So I will go through each of those in turn, no worries. So first, we'll look at the steps in identifying and developing those principles. So you remember that practice-based knowledge, like what the practitioners of a program know and do and their wisdom, is what informs principles. So the process I'm going to describe is all geared towards capturing that practice-based knowledge and getting it into the guide language, GUID, guiding, useful, inspirational, developmental, and evaluable. So I'm going to condense this quite in-depth, long-lasting process into a short amount of time. If you have questions about any part of it, feel free to get in touch with me. All righty. So when you're identifying principles, the first thing you want to do is some in-person group work. You get your program staff together and you do these things, which I'll talk about. You write success stories to share with the group. You look at those success stories and identify what they have in common. You draft up your principles according to the guide criteria, get them into a kind of language that will make them maximally helpful to people down the line. And to do all this, you commit to multiple rounds of sharing, revising, feedback, and collaboration. We'll look a little more under the hood here. So before you get your group together, have the program representatives prepare by writing a brief prevention success story to bring and share. What we asked people to do was write up something just like a page, maybe a page and a half, that would share a time when their event or their class or their programming went really beautifully and it made a big difference. And tell that story with so much information and detail so that people can really visualize and experience what the prevention person did. The next step is you get together and share these stories and compare them. The way we did it was that we had 2 to 4 people or organizations per group. Everybody had copies of the stories, swapped them and read them. They worked together to identify things in common across the stories, and then they named those themes, those commonalities, and that became the principles. I do want to note that when I discuss group processes and numbers of people here and also timelines, this is based on our experiences, kind of like a case study of Washington. I think there's definitely room to adapt principles identification work to smaller and larger groups. Like too many people or organizations wouldn't be feasible, but there's nothing magical about the number of people or orgs that we had doing this. Okay, So in a moment, I am going to read to you an example success story, which A, I got permission to share in this context, and B, we cleaned up quite a lot to make it non-identifiable, which seemed important considering. And as you're listening, or as you read later on the handout, because this is on one of our handouts too, think about what you notice of how is that practitioner behaving? What values are they demonstrating that are going to facilitate success in that program reaching its goals? All right, I'll take a sip of water before I read this. The example success story goes, when I first met Blaine, a white identified student, in the context of his health class prevention curriculum, he was so entrenched in his hypermasculinity that he would not even admit to ever experiencing physical pain. After a time, I noticed that when Blaine realized I saw him paying attention to my words or intently watching a video, he would quickly divert his eyes. He would try to pretend as if he hadn't been paying attention. Then I noticed that sometimes he would nod his head in agreement with something I said. In general, I made it a practice to stick around after class to check in with students, and I casually mentioned during class that these debriefs were a time when folks who haven't had a chance to speak could let me know their thoughts. One day, Blaine covertly stayed. He told me that he was having a hard time reconciling what was happening in class with what his friends would think, and shared that he felt anxious all the time. We talked about how it is normal to feel uncomfortable when trying on different ideas. I also worked with him to consider talking to a counselor about some of his anxious feelings. During the next class session, I worked in some content about the role of peers and the ways we can feel pressure to conform, but also sometimes be mistaken in what we assume peers think or believe. I tried to find moments of not only teaching bystander skills, but of modeling myself how to respectfully disagree with someone in a caring way. I also asked the young people to talk about their community, about its strengths, and also how the community might sometimes look the other way when folks were at risk of violence. Together, we generated strategies for navigating tough moments that took their home, peer, and community realities into account. Now, Blaine occasionally comes up to me after class to quietly say thank you or to apologize for his classmates' behavior, but he does not yet have the courage to do these things when his peers are watching. I see him engaged and nodding more often, and he told me that he is talking with someone about his anxious feelings. I count this as a success. So this is only one success story. If we were doing a real principles identification process, we would have multiple stories. And what we do with them is look for areas where there were overlapping behaviors or ways of being that seem to be facilitating the successes in the success stories. I would look at your story, you would look at my story, and you would say, oh, here's point of connection. So I'm going to try to replicate that process briefly here. The next step is you find the commonalities between and among stories. So on one side of the screen, you see a brief excerpt from the story about Blaine. During the next class session, I worked in some content about the role of peers, the way we can feel pressure to conform, sometimes be mistaken. And then here, this part with the red circle around it, it says, I tried to find moments to model how to respectfully disagree with someone. On the other side of the screen, there's an excerpt from a different success story. And let me read that real quick. To be honest, I am often close to tears after reading the entries. These are diary entries. Because I am so honored to have students share their stories with me. Each week, I write back to them. For that first prompt, I share something about myself with them, always balancing respect for their vulnerability and maintaining appropriate boundaries. So that last part there is circled in red because the commonality that we saw in our group across these two stories was that the practitioners were modeling boundaries and they were communicating in open, respectful ways. They were showing with their own behavior ways that they wanted the students to act more like. All right. So the next step is kind of To me, as a qualitative analyst, this is a qualitative analysis going on here, and other evaluators may also notice that when they look at this. So you're going from what you notice that's common across the stories, such as modeling boundaries and open, respectful communication. And you're saying, like, what's going on with that? How can we put a name on that commonality that we're seeing so that it's that label can become the principle, a tag to hang off it. So our draft principle based on that might be modeling. And then we would write a definition of that. So modeling is when you demonstrate how to recognize boundaries and communicate in open, respectful ways. This pretty language intensive piece of work to do with people. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. So you can see how the data from the success stories, after a lot of discussion and revision, turns into principles. It's like a process of reducing it. You kind of categorize, you summarize. It's easy to say it, but it can seem hard to do it. Like it has demands on you cognitively and conceptually. So if you are an evaluator who's working with sexual violence prevention practitioners to identify these principles, your goal is really to help them start with examples of what their diverse work has in common and move to this briefly stated principle. People can really do this if you give them permission and reinforcement. I have been very pleased to see it. I'm going to share, just to help us get our heads around this, an example that seems to really help people understand the process. I didn't actually use it with our Washington State practitioners in identifying principles. I came to this example later, but I definitely would in the future. So what we'll do is, like, let's use the jelly bean example and see if we can fit it onto modeling. If you imagine that all these beautiful jelly beans are components of how people implement their programs, or they're key ingredients that make the program successful, all together in a big mass, then these little jars are each person's success story that they bring that's full of potential principle elements. You go through a process where you identify the commonalities, like you put the like things together. And then you give each of the commonalities a vivid but short name that describes the theme that it represents. And that, I would say, in this metaphor, is your draft principle. So like the principle is red, or it's modeling. And that is another way of understanding that process you go through to identify a principle. Okay, another thing you can do when you're refining the principles, and this happens for the most part kind of backstage, so to speak, is you can bring in knowledge from the research base about what supports effective prevention. And this can be effective prevention just kind of generally in any area, or it can be sexual violence specific if that's your area. You can, if you are the content expert, you can do it. If you bring in an outside content expert who has knowledge of this field, they can look for things that might be kind of missing in the principles that have been identified, and then they can take that back to the practitioner group and vet that with them. Like, do you think it would be right to include this concept? So the way that you then start sharing, merging, and refining the draft principles is when you do this in person. We used a World Cafe process where we used those giant Post-its that you stick up on the wall. People would put up their draft principle their group came up with, and then tour around and write input for other groups on their principles. We were there, myself and some other facilitators, to help people make this happen in the moment. And we ended up with 7 principles out of this process. The target from the patent book is 4 to 8. I feel like 7 might be kind of a lot. We're sort of wishing we had stuck with maybe a few fewer, but 4 to 8 seems about right. Okay, I mentioned the World Cafe process. If you want more details on what that is and how it will work with groups, like step-by-step to use it, also a lot of other great content, let me refer you to the NSVRC Evaluation Toolkit. Same website as you got this webinar on, I dare say. You are noticing by now that the process of principles identification takes time. They end up in this very concise wording, but to get them there by working collaboratively, it will take you a while. there's this effort to bring in the practitioner voices and integrate them deeply to make sure all the participating programs see themselves reflected in the final principles, and that is going to take some time. Okay, so that all of that I just said was just step one, identifying the principles. I'm now going to switch over to talk about preparing to measure them both with practitioners and with program participants. All right. So what you want to end up with are questions. So you follow, for evaluators, a pretty standard measurement development approach. First, you figure out what you expect to see if this thing is working. Like, what will practitioners be doing if they're really adhering to this principle? And if practitioners are following the principle, what are you thinking you will see in program participants? Will they engage differently, have different behaviors, or what? Because of just time limitations, I'm going to focus on the process we used regarding practitioner behavior, but it's the same for assessing impacts on program participants. I'll walk you through what we did. It's not the one perfect way, but it worked pretty well for us, so it's just an example. We did another round of in-person group work with the same program staff. We gave each small group 2 of our 7 principles and had them brainstorm what they would think they'd see from practitioners when they were really upholding the principle. We wanted them to be as specific and behavioral as they could. What would the person be doing when they were facilitating their program that would show the principle was active? And we made some tailored worksheets for them to collect their ideas on, because we had noticed in the first round of principles identification that having that kind of container, that structure for the process, helped people know what they were, quote unquote, supposed to do and do it, and that they just felt more comfortable with more structure and guidance in that way. So we provided that using this tailored worksheet, as well as facilitation on site. We had people then do another World Cafe. Once they had worked in their small groups, they used those giant Post-its and World Cafe process to show each other what behaviors they thought went with each principle. And then they went around and added to other groups' work. And then we had a process of voting to kind of upvote or downvote the listed behaviors so that everybody collaborated on that. All right, this is not actually me creating questions based on the principles indicators, but we did it ourselves. Myself, Erin Casey, and some other evaluation specialist colleagues sat backstage and wrote questions to assess if we were seeing what we expected to see based on the behaviors that the practitioners had identified in that previous process. We wrote some for practitioners and some about changes in program participants as well. I'll give an example. So to illustrate, one of our Washington State principles was shared power, engage with others in ways that encourage equal participation. And the people who worked with us told us that what you would be seeing when shared power was in action, they said preventionists would work to engage all participants and audiences equally. They are welcoming to everyone in their attitudes and actions. They act as a facilitator rather than as a top-down expert. And then moving into what you would see in participants if practitioners were exemplifying shared power. As a result, participants and audiences believe their opinions and experiences are of equal value to those of other people. They also respect the opinions and experiences of others. So that's the behaviors. We made them into these questions. This question set on the screen is about evaluating the shared power principle with practitioners, prevention practitioners. So one example is, I incorporated participants' input into programming and discussions. And people have the answer options of strongly disagreeing to strongly agreeing for answer options. So in Washington State, prevention practitioners are self-assessing on these items for the subset of the 7 principles they're evaluating for their program. And we thought about doing this twice a year. I think we're now at at once a year. And I'll come back and talk about what we're doing with principles-focused evaluation as well, a little bit at the end. So here is an example of questions to evaluate with program participants whether the practitioner is using the shared power principle. So for example, the facilitator solicited contributions from different people. So these are quite similar, this data collection with participants, as the one that you may have done with practitioners, or the practitioner self-assessed. It doesn't have to mean a gigantic new measurement effort, like a bunch of new tools. It just means integrating a few new questions into whatever existing tools or observations you do. So you get participants' take on whether the principles are actually happening. Okay, so why are we measuring all these things? This is always a very important question to address. PFE, principles-focused evaluation, can really, I think, help reveal the how of prevention. So when your prevention participants achieve those behavioral or those attitudinal outcomes that you had hoped for, PFE can help you assess how and why that's happening. Or conversely, if the outcomes don't look like what you had hoped, PFE can help you understand where things might be going awry. And it can also identify the conditions where participants will most benefit from your program and are most likely to show the kind of movement that you want on the program outcomes. All right, so Washington State again. I now will give a little update of where we're at. We had plans several years ago to have full implementation of our principles-focused evaluation measures during this year. That's the RPE year that started in February 2020. So if we think back to February 2020, a lot did not go as hoped in the year since then for all of us in different ways. In Washington State, ads everywhere, programming and evaluation of that programming were first put on hold, and then they were adapted, and then they were often adapted again. So what I'm going to share now is pilot data from when we were first developing and testing the effectiveness principles and their indicators and measures. And after we see that, I'll briefly talk about how the CDC moved from a more individual level to more community level prevention programming, how that affected our PFE work and how we're integrating it. So with support from the Department of Health here, the principles are incorporated into the state RPE logic model. What grantees do is identify the subset of principles that are most relevant to them and their programming to assess. Grantees, like practitioners, self-assess on how well the principles are upheld in their prevention programming, and they are moving towards collecting data from participants. And Washington State is analyzing the principles self-assessments across all the programs and using that as part of our state level evaluation reporting. So here you will see a chart from our pilot where practitioners rated the relevance of the principles, each principle to them. So 3 here was agree and 4 was strongly agree. So here are averages, and you'll see that for nearly every principle, the average is between agree and strongly agree. Sometimes it's like for consent culture, the average is strongly agree at the high end. This is an excerpt from the actual assessment by practitioners of the extent to which they were using these principles. So they rated themselves on behaviors associated with each one. And this table shows the percent of practitioners who gave each response for each indicator. So this is shared power because we've used this as an example a lot in this talk, but we have self-assessments for all 7 of the principles. So you can see, for example, incorporate participants' input into programming. The majority of practitioners, 70%, said that they were usually able to do that, they felt. The next steps for principles-focused evaluation in Washington State, which still accurately reflects where we're at for the most part, is that we've got these measures. They're part of our state level RPE evaluation toolkit, and they're guiding, they're one element of evaluating programming, and the toolkit is kind of guiding the evaluation of all the programming. We're still hoping to get measurement of program participants' outcomes and to be able to link them back to preventionists' adherence to the principles. But this is something that's has not gone as quickly as anticipated because of the pandemic. So stay tuned for more on that. And we've also been somewhat affected by the CDC's reorientation to community level prevention. We had identified the principles and developed them based on individual level prevention programming, and thinking that that was where we were at. But because of the reorientation, we now have, and also just the progress of time being in a new RPE funding cycle, 4 out of Washington's 6 RPE grantees are doing community level prevention. Now, I'm happy to say that many of the principles do still apply quite well. They look a little different, but it's kind of a validation of the principles approach in my mind. We're doing some measurement refinement, but most principles do still apply to most programming. So we're moving forward, tinkering with our measurement to be able to do this on the community level. If you want more information on principles-focused evaluation and then some other things that we're doing in Washington State, we made this toolkit, which is available at our Department of Health's website. I think that link will be clickable on your screen when you're watching the webinar. So I invite you to check that out for more details on the principles measurement. Let me recap. So principles-focused evaluation. You create a list of principles that try to reflect the essence of your work and that balance the need to articulate a clear goal of where you're headed with prevention work while also allowing for adaptation. You identify what you want to see if the principles are alive and in action, and then you do data collection to see if what you would expect is happening. That's the evaluation part. I think that one of the real powerful things about principles-focused evaluation is that you get this great program tool, and also you get a great evaluation measure. The grantees we worked with told us they really enjoyed the process of identifying principles itself, the sharing, the success stories, the working to see what all their different efforts really had in common at their core. And one person said, it was so poetic. She said, it was like returning to drink from a really deep well, like the well of what was informing all their work. So this was something that we did not anticipate, but of course, we're very glad to have shared with us when the person said that. I think that reaches the end of the webinar. So thank you again for listening, for watching, and I'm going to hand it back to Sally to close us out today.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. I think you've given us a lot to think about. I really appreciate the visualization of that well that I think we can all come back to. I also am excited about what is to come with folks using this approach as new ways of doing community level prevention to address sexual assault are being developed. It seems like it's a great time to start talking about that. So thank you everyone for viewing this webinar from our Evaluation Toolkit webinar series. We'll invite you to come back to the toolkit as much as possible. We do update it on a regular basis, and you can find all of those materials at www.nsvrc.org. Thank you so much.